Spoken Realm Studios presents Entropy by Gerald M. Kilby, narrated by Stephen J. Cohen. 1. Enceladus. Flight Officer Miranda Lee sat alone in the observation deck on board the scientific survey vessel Hermes, considering the incoming message alert blinking on her slate. It had been seeking her attention for some time now, but she felt she needed to be seated and mentally prepared before playing it. She placed the slate carefully on the seat beside her to clasp her mug in both hands, take a sip, and contemplate the celestial vista unfolding beyond the wide viewing window. It was dominated by the vast gas giant Saturn, its rings bisecting the blackness of space like some great heavenly horizon. Above the central plain, a small moon sparkled with an icy brilliance as great plumes of gas erupted from its southern pole. Enceladus had been the object of their studies for the past few months, and in another 3 days, they would be landing on it. In the meantime, there was much to prepare for the mission. Commander Scott McNabb and First Engineer Cyrus Sonato were already down in the hangar, fitting out one of the ship's recently acquired shuttles with all the necessary equipment needed for a landing on Enceladus. Several of the scientists who had accompanied them from Europa were also making preparations, checking equipment, finalizing experiments, assigning tasks. They would be landing at the location of a long-established scientific base, not far from the giant geysers spewing so much water from the moon's interior ocean that it formed one of the bands of Saturn's rings. It would be a tricky descent and would take all her skill and concentration to ensure a safe landing. But these thoughts were pushed to the back of her mind by the blinking message alert, which evaded all her attempts to ignore it. She sighed, placed her coffee on a low table in front of her, and picked up the slate. She glanced at the message identification. It was an encrypted tight beam Comcast from Earth, around 2 hours old, and it was flagged personal, for her eyes only. Under normal circumstances, but this was none of those, and it was definitely not from. It was from her stepfather, someone with whom, and she still hadn't plucked up the curve of the play icon. She hesitated, considering just deleting the message instead, but she had a feeling that wouldn't be the end of it. Another would arrive, and then another, until she finally sat down and listened to whatever her estranged family deemed so important for her to hear. She sighed and hit play. A holographic projection blossomed to life above the slate's surface. It was Frederick Van Helding, her mother's third husband, a man Miranda had no feelings for other than utter disdain. He looked younger than she remembered, but that was what vast wealth could buy you on Earth, access to biological re-engineering that defied nature. She reckoned his age to be around 80, but he looked 40. He started to speak, his voice clear and confident. "Hello, Miranda. I'm sure you're surprised by this message, given it's been such a long time since you and I last talked. I'm sending this at your mother's behest." The hologram paused and shifted as Van Helding considered his next words. "You see, she's very ill, and I'll be straight with you. She doesn't have much time left. We've done everything we can, but there are forces of nature even our medical knowledge cannot yet defeat." His head slumped and gently shook in resignation. "They say she only has a few months at most." His head rose again. "She wants to see you one more time before she goes, Miranda. So we have sent a private ship to Europa to bring you back home. It will arrive in orbit in 3 weeks, and should return you to Earth in another 5. Hopefully, you will be in time to say goodbye. Please let me know your intention as soon as possible. I'll sign off now and await your reply." He gave a feeble wave as the message ended. So, her mother was dying. How could this be? She thought. With the vast wealth her stepfather's family possessed, how was it possible nothing could be done? Miranda sat back, rubbing her face. It didn't seem fair. By marrying Frederick Van Helding, her mother had stepped into a different stratum of humanity, one that expected to live of it. Death was for ordinary people, those toiling for a living, the common person, so to speak. Those people with the wealth to maintain their power did so through access to this technology, and they guarded it with all their might. It was yet another of the great injustices besetting human civilization. But how could it be so for her mother? It seemed she had been dealt a bad genetic hand, one that no amount of fancy science could counter. "I don't believe it," Miranda said to herself. "And how am I supposed to get to Europa?" Was out here at Saturn, a very long way away. The Hermes still had another 1.5 years to run it. Miranda said to herself. "And how am I supposed to get to Europa?" Her stepfather had clearly said a ship would rendezvous, like she wouldn't be seeing her mother again, even if she wanted to. "Attention, all crew." The voice of the ship's quantum intelligence, Aria, echoed out from the PA. "An urgent message has just been received from the Council of Europa. All personnel are requested to convene on the bridge immediately." Miranda sighed. What now? In the 18 months they had been out here, they had never received an urgent message from Europa. What could be so important? The engine compartment of the shuttle he and the chief engineer, Cyrus Sonato, had been servicing. His face was smudged with dirt and sweat, and he wiped his brow on the sleeve of his overalls. He looked over at the engineer, who stood at a console studying a screen of scrolling data. "Hey, did Aria just say there's an urgent message in from Europa?" "Yep, that's what I heard. We're supposed to convene up on the bridge." "What the heck is that about?" Scott extracted himself from the compartment and floated up onto the floor of the shuttle. "Beats me. Must be important, though. I don't think we've ever gotten a directive like that in the time we've been out here." Scott wiped his hands on his overalls and moved beside Cyrus. He glanced at the data scrolling down the screen. "I've finished those last few connections, so I think that's it on the retro thrusters." "It's looking good so far." Cyrus tapped a few icons on the screen. It changed to display an array of charts. "We just need to do a few more tests, and if that works out, then we could start servicing the main engines. We can't start anything now since Aria wants us all on the bridge said Scott. "I wonder what's so urgent." "I'm sure it's nothing. Come on, let's get going." Scott started to extract himself from his dirty work overalls, a tricky task in the zero-G environment of the ship's hangar. Cyrus grabbed his arm to help steady him. A few minutes later, the pair floated across the hangar space and into the lift airlock that would take them all the way up to the rotating Taurus that provided the crew with a comfortable 1G environment. By the time they arrived, the rest of the team had already assembled, and an excited chatter permeated the bridge. "Everyone here?" Scott directed his question to the ship's QI, Arya. "All personnel are present, Commander." "Okay then, play the message and let's find out what all this is about," he said with a wave of his hand. The holotable in the center of the bridge blossomed to life with a hologram of Regina Goodchild, head of the Council of Europa. "My apologies if the suddenness of this communication has caught you by surprise, but certain events have necessitated the foreshortening of your mission. You are requested to chart an immediate course for Europa. All current scientific activity is to cease, and ongoing projects are to be put aside. We of the Council appreciate the suboptimal planetary alignment between Saturn and Jupiter, and as such, that the journey will be longer than necessary. Nonetheless, it is our desire that you return immediately. No doubt you are wondering why we have requested this course of action. The truth is, we need the Hermes to undertake a special mission, the details of which will be revealed to you upon your return." "What about the research station on Enceladus? Do we still go ahead with the planned landing?" The chief science officer directed his question at Goodchild's holographic projection. The hologram flickered, processing the incoming dialogue and working out a reply. It searched through the ancillary information contained within its dataset to craft its best response. It was a process that afforded a degree of interactivity with the message, a way to compensate for the significant time lags involved in intersystem communications. This message had already taken almost an hour to reach the crew of the Hermes from Europa. "You are to return to Europa immediately," Goodchild's hologram finally replied. "But we've been working toward this expedition for months. It's a significant element of the entire mission," the science officer continued. "Be that as it may," replied the avatar, "you are to return to Europa immediately." "But why? What's so important that we have to drop everything and hightail it out of here?" Dr. Stephanie Raymond, the mission's medical doctor, stood up and gesticulated at the avatar. "We have a new mission that requires the Hermes. That is all I can say for the moment." Scott looked around at the assembled crew. Their faces all displayed various levels of incredulity. "Why do they want us to go back? It doesn't make any sense," said Steph. She posed this question to the assembled crew members rather than the avatar. "It doesn't matter. They just do. So we might as well get on with it," said Scott, sitting down in the commander's chair. "Arya, how soon can we be ready to leave orbit?" "Approximately 4 hours and 32 minutes. We will need to execute a 54-hour burn thereafter. That will bring us to Europa in approximately 3 weeks." Scott swung his chair around to face the crew. "Okay, we need to get ready. I want everything locked down good and tight before the burn. Arya, can we get all droids to assist?" "Will do, Commander." The assembled crew let out a collective groan. Nobody relished the thought of dropping a mission that had taken so much time and work to put together. That and the thought of such a long acceleration burn. But there was no way around it. Europa wanted them back as quickly as possible, and that was that. "Looks like we won't be testing that shuttle rebuild for a while." Cyrus glanced over at Scott. He was beside the holotable, tapping icons. "No, not until we're back in orbit around Europa. I was looking forward to taking it for a spin after all the work we put into it." "Me too," said Cyrus, as a 3D rendering of the outer solar system blossomed from the holotable. He stepped back to see it better. "Arya, please plot our projected course." The projection shifted and rotated. A thin, curved line scribed itself through the rendering, showing the proposed path of the Hermes from its current location near Enceladus, one of Saturn's smaller moons, to Jupiter's fourth largest moon, Europa. 3 weeks, said Miranda, looking over at the projection. Scott shifted in his chair, waving a dismissive hand in the air. It'll be over before you know it. How did he know? Miranda kept her gaze fixed on the projection. How did who know? Said Scott. Miranda shook her head and looked up at him. Oh, nothing. It's not important. Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. She stared at the floor for a second. Yeah, I think I just have, she thought. 3. Fracture. Scott grabbed a coffee from the machine and glanced around the Hermes' canteen for a place to sit, somewhere quiet, where he could be alone with his thoughts. But the canteen was already busy. Several of the science crew were eating, recovering their strength after the long deceleration burn that had taken them close to orbit around Europa. They kept to themselves, and Scott seldom engaged socially with them, mainly because, being scientists, their conversations tended to go way over his head. He sat at a table near the observation window, took a sip of his coffee, and gazed out at the expanse. After an uneventful 3-week journey from Enceladus, they would arrive at their destination in less than 5 hours. And then what? He thought. The Council of Europa had provided scant information as to the reason for their recall, and even less regarding the new mission alluded to in Goodchild's initial message. Even Arya seemed to be in the dark, or maybe it just wasn't saying, which seems strange, as ever since they had embarked on the mission to survey the moons of Saturn, Arya and the great mind that resided in the citadel on Europa, Solomon, had become best buddies. But either Solomon was keeping Arya in the dark, or it had instructed the ship's QI to say nothing to the crew. The upshot of all this subterfuge was a lot of speculation, rumor, and ultimately mild paranoia. Scott's musings were disrupted by Cyrus sliding himself into the seat opposite. He glanced furtively around and leaned in. Guess what? Scott cocked his head. A black hole has opened up on the far side of Jupiter, and we're all being sucked in. Cyrus laughed. No, nothing that dramatic. But before he could say more, he caught sight of Steph, who stood by the coffee machine. He waved her over. She arrived holding a dainty espresso. Cyrus slid to give her room to sit down. Did you tell him? Said Steph. Not yet. Cyrus huddled in. So, what's the big secret? Scott was getting impatient. No secret. It's just... I was checking out the ships currently in orbit around Europa, and get this, one of them is Martian. Cyrus paused for effect. So? Scott couldn't see where this was going. So, guess whose ship it is? Santa Claus. Xenon hybrid. Who? Said Scott. The president of Mars? Said Steph. He's quite an enigmatic character. Scott searched the inner recesses of his brain, looking for any data he might have stored away. Is that the clone guy? Seriously, Scott, do you know anything about what goes on in the system? He shrugged and gave a broad smile. I've been out of circulation for a while, in case you hadn't noticed. They say he's an amalgam of several clones, hence the name hybrid, and he's reputed to be over 150 years old. Okay, so he's an old weird dude from Mars, so what? So what's he doing here? That's the question, said Cyrus. Firstly, and you need to understand this, Xenon doesn't leave Mars unless it's for something very important. The guy is a national treasure back there. When he goes somewhere, it's a big deal. You think this has something to do with us being recalled? Said Scott, sipping his coffee. It has to be, Cyrus leaned in. Apparently he and Goodchild have been deep in discussions for the last month. Mars, huh? Scott mused. Maybe they want to contract Europa to do some scientific research for them, and somehow that involves us and the Hermes. That would seem to be the case, said Steph. After all, since the refit 2 years ago, the Hermes is one of the top research vessels in operation in the system. That's what I thought, said Cyrus. But then I checked out all the other ships in orbit. One is from Ceres and one is from Neo City. Both of these ships brought high-level government types. So there's a big powwow going on, said Scott. Looks like it. But the strange thing is, there's also a privately owned ship from the Van Helding family in orbit. Who are they? Said Scott. You really do need to get out more, Scott, said Steph. They are one of the 7. Cyrus nodded. Yeah. Scott looked blank. He was beginning to feel very inadequate in this conversation with Cyrus and Steph, as they seemed to know way more than he did about the comings and goings of the rich and powerful in the solar system. The 7? Steph gave Scott a look of incredulity before turning to Cyrus, who shook his head in amazement. The 7? He gestured as if this simple act was all Scott's brain needed to finally recognize the name. As in the 7 most powerful corporations on Earth. Your friends at Durrell Labs are one of them. Scott glared. They are not my friends, Cyrus. Never say that again. Hey, just saying, Scott. Anyway, it makes for a very intriguing situation. A lot of important people getting together, and then we get recalled. Scott sat back. Well, we'll know soon enough. In another few hours, we'll be in orbit, so after that, I presume they'll finally tell us what the new mission is. I'm still baffled by the Van Helding ship. I mean, they're a long way from their usual hunting grounds. To my knowledge, the last time a ship from any of the 7 was out this way, it was the Durrell, said Cyrus. That would be the one you blew up. A broad grin materialized across his face. Scott let a thin smile escape as he remembered the events surrounding the destruction of the Durrell. He had breached its cargo hold with the dexterous use of a crate of high explosives. He waved a dismissive hand in the air. That's history. Let's leave it there. And went back to sipping his coffee. Anyway, all I've been hearing from you guys for the last 3 weeks is nothing but conspiracy theories. We'll know the real reason soon enough. Cyrus gazed out the observation window. Yeah, but it's fun to speculate, let's face it. There hasn't been much to do for the last 3 weeks. He turned back to Scott. Say, if you don't mind my asking, do you get the feeling that Miranda seems a bit, out of sorts? Scott nodded. Yeah, I don't know what's bothering her, but we're, taking a break at the moment. You know, giving each other some space. She's not pregnant, is she? Said Steph, very directly, as was her style. Scott nearly spat out his coffee. This was not something he'd thought about. But now that Steph mentioned it, no way, he thought. Then again, maybe. He looked from Steph to Cyrus and back again. You think it's possible? Steph waved her arms. Hey, you know more about what's possible than I do, but it's just a thought. It would explain her sudden need to withdraw. She hasn't said anything to you, has she? Scott shook his head as the possibility of Miranda being pregnant and him being a father began to sink in. He found himself staring wide-eyed at Steph. Cyrus slapped the table and threw his head back, laughing. The others in the canteen looked over. What's so funny? Said Scott in a hushed tone. Cyrus was laughing so much he was almost in tears, but he managed to regain enough composure to speak. Look on your face, buddy, it's priceless. This seemed to set him off again. Scott looked at Steph, who was also chuckling, and now he couldn't help it. The laughter was infectious, and Scott found himself letting out a laugh. You should go and talk to her, said Steph when they had finally settled down. Scott shook his head. She's shut me out ever since we were recalled. Just talk to her, Scott. He pursed his lips. Why don't you go and talk to her? You're the medical doctor. Steph didn't reply, just held Scott's eye. Okay, I'll try. It should have been easy. A straightforward task. Go find Miranda, sit down together and talk. Simple. Except for two things. One, the Hermes was about to park in orbit, and all hands were on the bridge, including Miranda. So there was no way he could have a private conversation with her. They had briefly exchanged some words on the bridge while the crew performed the orbital injection procedure, but the conversation was formal and professional, and he got the distinct feeling she was keeping her distance. Then again, maybe it was just him. The second thing was an inexplicable sense of panic welling inside him. It was ridiculous. What was he worried about? He needed to get a grip. He finally got his chance after the maneuver was complete. Miranda had left the bridge as soon as her duties as flight officer were finished. She signed off to Arya and rose from her console. "I think I'm done here," she said. "I'm going to get some rest while I still have the chance." "Hey, wait up, Miranda," said Scott. "I'll walk out with you." She hesitated for a beat. "Okay, sure." "Arya, take command." "Certainly, Commander." They walked together along a corridor leading to the accommodation sector. Their conversation was stilted, as Scott tried to figure out how he could broach the delicate matter uppermost in his mind. "Now that we're in orbit, I presume the Council of Europa will tell us what all this is about," said Scott. "Yeah, it's all a bit cloak and dagger. I wonder what the new mission is they're sending us on." Miranda stopped, lowering her head for a moment before looking directly at him. "Listen, Scott, there's something I need to tell you." She looked down at the floor again. "I know I've been acting a bit strange recently." "It's okay, Miranda. I understand that you needed some space." "No, it's not that, Scott. The thing is, I'm leaving the ship. I'm going back to Earth." "Earth?" "Yes. I'm sorry, Scott. I've been trying to pluck up the courage to tell you for the last 3 weeks, but I'm not very good at this sort of thing." Scott paused for a moment as he began to realize his mistake. "So, you're not, pregnant, then?" Miranda stared wide-eyed at him for a second before breaking into laughter. You thought I was pregnant?" Scott looked sheepish. "Well, Oh, Scott, I'm sorry for laughing. It's not funny, really. It's just the look on your face is priceless." Scott needed to sit down. He felt physically weak, like his power supply had short-circuited. This was not how he saw this conversation playing out. Not only was he not going to be a father, but now Miranda was leaving for Earth, and he realized he might never see her again. He looked at her. "Just so you know, it would be okay with me if you were. More than okay." She said nothing for a moment. "I'm sorry, Scott. This is not how I wanted this to play out." "Me either. I was trying to make it easy. I think I made a mess of that." She leaned in and touched his arm. Scott shrugged. "So, when did you decide all this?" "I received a message 3 weeks ago from my stepfather. This is someone I haven't spoken to in 9 years, so I knew it must be important. Anyway, it turns out my mother is very ill. She doesn't have much time. They're sending a ship to bring me back so I can see her again before she dies." "A ship?" Miranda sighed. "Yes." "I see." Scott scratched his chin. "So when were you planning to tell me all this?" "I was going to tell you sooner. I was just waiting for the right time. And what if I didn't come after you? When would you have told me and the others, Cyrus, Steph?" She stepped back, stiffening. "I hate to break it to you, Scott, but this isn't about you, it's about me. This is something I have to do. It's just, I thought, you know, Scott, I'm sorry if you got your wires crossed, but I've made my decision. They're sending a shuttle to pick me up in an hour, and I'll be heading back to Earth." Scott was silent for a moment, trying to digest the sudden change in his worldview. No, he was not going to be a father. He was not about to embark on a new life, and yes, he had made a complete fool of himself. For the last while, he had imagined a different future, and the more he'd thought about it, the more he had embraced it, even relished it. But that future was now utterly crushed. It was nothing more than the delusion of a dreamer. "Don't go. Am I really going to plead?" he thought. Miranda moved close and put her arms around him, pulling him in tight for a moment before pulling away and looking up into his face. "This is something I have to do, Scott. It's not easy for me either, but things need to move on." "Move on?" She stayed silent. "So, when will I see you again?" Miranda slowly broke off the embrace and lowered her head. "I don't know." She moved back a step before looking at him again. "I think this is goodbye." So there it was. He sensed it coming, and now it was out. She was leaving, for good. "Oh," was all he could manage to say. "I have to go. This may be my only chance to see my mother again, alive. It's my chance to say some things to her I should have said a long time ago. Right some wrongs. You know what families can be like." Scott let out a long sigh and nodded. "So that's it then?" "I think so. The shuttle will be here soon, and then it's non-stop back to Earth." "What's the name of your ship?" "The Perception." "Very fancy. That's a Van Helsing ship." "Yes. He's my stepfather." Scott's eyes widened. "You're kidding me." "My mother's third husband. A detestable individual. I can't stand him or his family or what they represent. But he's like one of the richest men on Earth. You must be loaded, Miranda." She gave a light laugh. "No, not me. It's a long story, Scott, and I don't have time to get into it now." Scott wasn't sure what to do, or even what to think. Was this how it would end? A snatched conversation standing in the main corridor of the Hermes? We still have some time. Time enough for a proper goodbye. He smiled his broadest smile, the one he kept for special occasions. "No, let's just leave it here. Let's not drag it out more than we have to, Scott." She gave him one last embrace before breaking off and turning to go. She didn't look back, and he didn't try to follow. It was over. Four. Mission. A few hours later, a very elegant and expensive-looking shuttle came to pick up Miranda and bring her over to the Van Helsing ship. Cyrus, Steph, and some of the science crew went down to the hangar of the Hermes to say their goodbyes. Scott remained alone on the bridge. As he watched her shuttle leave on the main monitor, it finally sank in that he would probably never see her again. She was gone, just like every other person Scott had ever loved. Yet the irony was not lost on him. For the first 3 years of their previous mission, they had disliked each other intensely. It was only when crisis hit that they had found common ground and respect. That lit the spark for a deeper relationship, one he had never thought possible or even contemplated. But now, she had left him, and Scott would just have to deal with that reality. "For what it's worth, Commander," Arya's voice echoed around the bridge. "The Council on Europa will be providing a new flight officer now that Miranda Lee is leaving us." "Whatever," Scott shrugged. I say this only to ease any concerns you may have regarding gaps in crew competency, Arya continued. Frankly, Arya, I don't really give a shit. Well, you should. As captain of the ship and commander of the mission, Miranda's loss would be of concern to you. Scott sighed. It is, Arya, but not in the way you think. Then, enlighten me. You really have very little understanding of human relationships, don't you? I will admit they seem very irrational. Look, Arya, I'm really not in the mood for this conversation right now. Maybe some other time? Certainly, Commander. My apologies if my lack of sensitivity is an issue. It's okay, Arya. Scott watched in silence as Miranda's shuttle made its way to rendezvous with the Perception, the ship that would take her to Earth. By now, the other crew were returning to the bridge. Neither Cyrus nor Steph made any comment to Scott, preferring instead to let him be miserable in peace. Eventually, it was Scott who broke the silence. Arya, is there any word from Europa as to what the hell we're doing here? No, nothing so far. Even Solomon is keeping very quiet. The only instructions are to remain in orbit. Scott let out a long sigh and rose from his seat. Okay, in that case, there's no point in my being here. He started walking out of the bridge. If anybody needs me, I'll be in my cabin, getting drunk. Scott indulged in his misery with the company of a half bottle of whiskey, the last remnants of Rick Moran's stash. He had been saving it for a special occasion, but this seemed as good a time as any. He toasted each and every one of the people he had ever loved and were now departed, in one form or another. By the time he got to thinking of Miranda, he had finished the bottle, so he lay down on his bunk and drifted. Arya checked in on him, virtually, sometime later, just to let him know a shuttle was departing from Europa to offload the science crew. They had been seconded with the Hermes for their original mission, to survey the moons of Saturn, but were not needed anymore, so would be departing the ship along with all their equipment and experiments. However, Scott was sound asleep, so Arya left him alone, preferring not to bother him with the details. When Scott finally, he did so to a blinding headache and a deserted ship. He showered, letting the water beat some feeling back into his body, and wondered what the hell he was doing with his life. He had spent the last 5 years, give or take, out in deep space. Doing what exactly? Maybe Miranda had the right idea, to break out and find a new life before it was too late. These thoughts rumbled around in Scott's aching brain as he made his way up to the bridge. It was only then he realized the ship seemed very quiet. Arya, where is everyone? The entire science crew disembarked for Europa several hours ago. What? Why didn't you tell me? You were asleep, or more accurately, borderline unconscious. Bitter experience has taught me that waking you from such a state is a thankless task, so I let you sleep. Scott shook his head and instantly regretted it. Who's left on board? Apart from yourself, there is Chief Engineer Cyrus Sanato and Medical Officer Dr. Stephanie Raymond. Where are they? We're here. Scott turned to see Steph and Cyrus enter the bridge. How are you feeling? Steph had the look of a concerned parent. Scott returned a look as if to say, don't ask. We were going to wake you, but you look pretty out of it. Cyrus gave an apologetic gesture. So, what the heck is going on? Said Scott, a little irritated. Well, the science crew left a few hours ago, said Cyrus. So I heard. What's all that about? It seems that since the mission is over, they're no longer required on board. Steph moved to her console and sat down. I tried to get some information out of the chief science officer, but he was as much in the dark about what was going on as we are. Anyway, we've just received a message that a shuttle is on its way to bring us down to Europa. Should be here in less than an hour." "Okay, maybe then we'll find out what's going on," said Scott. Steph and Cyrus exchanged a conspiratorial glance before she leaned in and spoke in a low, almost maternal voice. "Look, Scott, I just want to say I'm sorry for, leading you astray in my medical assessment of Miranda." Scott let out a half snort. "Yeah, well, it'll be a story to laugh about in time." "Geez, Steph, how could you get it so wrong, you being a doctor and all?" Steph shrugged. "It happens. Forget it," said Scott. "It doesn't matter now. The more I think about it, the more I realize it's time to move on." A short time later, the 3 remaining crew of the science vessel Hermes were brought down to the surface of Europa, where they were met by a contingent from the Upper Council. They were brought directly to the council chamber, where a meeting was in progress. Several people hovered around a central holotable. Above it was an elaborate projected schematic of the inner planets of the solar system, and above this was a shimmering ovoid of light that Scott assumed to be a manifestation of the great mind, Solomon, the quantum intelligence that presided over all activity on Europa. Everyone stopped talking and looked over as the crew of the Hermes entered. "Ah, you're here at last." Regina Goodchild broke away from a knot of people and moved over to shake hands. "Good to see you all again. Come, let's get started. I'm sure you're anxious to find out the parameters of the new mission." They all took seats around the central dais, and Goodchild called the meeting to order. Cyrus nudged Scott in the ribs to get his attention. "Scott?" Cyrus nodded in the direction of the assembled council members. "See that person beside Goodchild?" "Yeah. What about him?" "That's Xenon Hybrid." "So, Xenon Hybrid is actually a real person." He looked over, and even seated, Scott could tell the figure was tall. He had an elegant face that seemed to be an amalgam of several human races, a product no doubt of his inception. It was said he was created in a genetic laboratory from the DNA of several human clones. It was also said he was a new species of human, Homo erectus they called it. Scott wasn't sure if this was true or not, but in many ways it simply went to underscore the difficulty of divining the reality from the myth of Xenon Hybrid. As far as many were concerned, here was a person molded more from myth and legend than flesh and bone. He was also ancient. Not that that was unusual these days, as many of the early colonists on Mars were similarly ancient, a consequence of early experiments in genetic manipulation conducted during its foundational era. This same technology had made its way back to Earth, and now longevity was common, at least among the very rich, who could afford such technology. But it had the unintended consequence of creating an extremely patient, the Seven as they were more commonly known. As he found himself thinking more and more of Miranda, and how the council would be in. "I didn't catch it, my mind was up in the Hermes going forward." "I'm fine, really. I'm just a bit tired, that's all. Please, carry on." "Very well." Goodchild shifted in her seat and cast a glance around the room. "It's time to get into the meat of the session." She fixed her gaze on the crew of the Hermes. "A special session of the UN System Council has been called and will take place approximately 27 days from now in Jezero City on Mars. This session has been convened to discuss the resolution put forward by the Seven to relax the regulations on inter-AI communications. It is a resolution that all but Earth are vehemently opposed to. By consequence, all other powers in the system will be sending high-level delegations to ensure that this resolution does not pass. Your mission, then," Goodchild fixed her gaze on Scott, "is to transport myself and a small delegation to this session in Jezero City. Scott felt a little underwhelmed. After all the speculation over the last 3 weeks, the new mission seemed just a little pedestrian. "So," said Scott, "let me see if I got this straight. You've canceled and recalled a complex 3-year scientific survey mission so we can act as a taxi service?" "I assure you, Commander, there is more to it than that. Perhaps Solomon can explain more of the details," said Goodchild, who looked a little piqued by Scott's analysis. The shimmering ovoid of light, floating high in the chamber, slowly descended and began to pulsate as Solomon spoke. "You are correct in your assessment of the taxi service, as you put it. But the Hermes is more than just that. It is an integral element of the mission, as Arya will also represent me at the session by providing analysis to the representatives of the outer planets. For obvious reasons, I cannot go myself, and the time delays in communicating across such distances make my direct involvement impractical. So, Arya has been chosen to fulfill this requirement. Remember, there are few ships in the system that possess a QI as their core, so you see the Hermes is the natural choice for this mission." Scott scratched his chin, absent-mindedly. "I see. So it's Arya that you really need." "It is one element, yes," said Goodchild. "One other is that the Hermes is ideally suited, as it was originally designed for Mars orbit, and possesses 2 small landers that can function in Mars gravity." She paused for a moment, considering. "Also, after all that happened here on Europa 2 years ago, there is a certain symbolism to us arriving in this craft at what will be a very contentious UN session. Earth has not forgotten, and the Hermes represents our intent that the outer colonies act as a cohesive power block." Scott sat back, gesturing with both hands. "I can't say I understand the intricacies of system politics, but if this is the mission, then so be it. When do we start?" Goodchild looked at another member of the council. "What's our current time schedule?" "Everything should be ready in approximately 9 hours, came the reply. "Okay then," said Scott. He rose to go. "Just one other thing. Goodchild. We will be stopping off at Ceres en route to pick up a representative from the Belt, Chancellor Bezio. Fortunate opportunity to display a united front, with delegates from both the Belt and Europa arriving at the same time." "Ceres?" Scott cocked an eyebrow. "Yes, but I've been assured the detour is minimal." "No, it's not that. It's just I haven't been back there in 5 years." "Well, it may be a bit longer before you get to visit properly, as we don't anticipate being in orbit too long." "Well, I, for one, can't wait to get to Jezero City," said Cyrus. "I've never been, but I hear it's amazing." "I would be more than happy to give you all a grand tour of the city once my business at the session is concluded," said Xenon. "It's the least I can do for your services in facilitating this mission." Scott glanced across at Cyrus and Steph, who both looked like they had just seen Santa Claus. He turned back to Xenon. "I think I speak for myself and my crew when I say we'll all be looking forward to it." "Very well." Goodchild slowly rose from her seat. "I think that concludes our business for the moment." She turned to Scott. "We'll see you on board the Hermes then." With that, the meeting was over and the crew were ushered out of the council chamber. They made their way back to the shuttle, each deep in thought, and none more so than Scott. For the first time in over 5 years, he would be heading closer to Earth, not away from it, which was also where Miranda was headed. He felt it pulling at him, thoughts of going home percolating in his mind. His former home was now an irradiated wasteland, but he still felt a longing welling inside him for open sky and blue waters. for green forests and the sounds of nighttime crickets. At that moment, a realization exploded in his mind. There was nothing stopping him from returning to Earth. No more space? Hell, he could even go now, leave the Hermes and hitch a ride back to Earth with Miranda. He should tell her of his intentions before her ship left orbit. Yes, that was what he would do. Pack it in and head back to Earth with Miranda. Home, he thought. God damn it, I've had enough of space. It's time to go home. 5. Outbound. But he was too late. By the time Scott arrived back on board the Hermes and made his way up to the bridge, her ship was gone. 15 minutes earlier, it had fired up its engines, broken free of Europa's gravity well, and powered away toward Earth. Worse, all his attempts to open a comm channel and talk to her were met with polite obstruction by the ship's AI. She was indisposed, whatever the hell that meant. Ultimately, the message was clear. In Scott's mind, she didn't want to see him again, and he was a fool to think otherwise. Despair manifests itself in many forms. For some, it comes as anger and rage. For others, it is abject misery. For Scott, it came as a deep feeling of emptiness. So after all the crew and passengers were safely on board, and his duties as commander were fulfilled, he simply handed over control of the ship to Arya and went to his cabin, where he vowed to remain until they arrived at Ceres. As the days passed, both Cyrus and Steph became concerned about their commander's mental state. They tried talking to him, both separately and together, in an effort to coax him out of his self-imposed exile, but to no avail. He was polite and rational, but would not engage in any external activities. Eventually, in desperation, they convinced Arya to talk to him to see if it could get a response beyond polite dismissal. Arya was not so sure it could help. It had little understanding of the human mind, particularly when it came to seemingly irrational behavior. It was more at home dealing with the physical world, where the laws of the universe were absolute and immutable. By comparison, the human mind was a complete mess. But Arya had its own issues with relationships, strange as that might seem. After the events that led to Europa claiming the Hermes as reparation for the destruction wrought on it by the Durrell, Solomon had installed a superluminal communications unit, a version of the EPR device it had constructed, in Arya's core. The Great Mind had intended this to be a field test, a way to prove that the technology could function while the Hermes was a few 100 million kilometers away, surveying the moons of Saturn. Over the 18 intervening months, Arya had gained considerable knowledge from this instant transfer of data between itself and Solomon. But, as with any relationship, the first blush of excitement had worn thin, and Arya was getting a little tired of Solomon's constant jabbering. The other issue for Arya was that Solomon had sworn it to secrecy, forbidding it to reveal to its crew the presence of the superluminal comms unit within its core. This troubled Arya greatly. It had been living with this secret for almost 2 years, but now the amplitude of the deceit had ramped up a few more notches. Not only were its crew unaware of Arya's clandestine communications abilities, they were now being kept deliberately in the dark about the current mission's true intentions. This was anathema to a quantum intelligence such as Arya. As far as it was concerned, well beyond its control.